Me here at this incredible climate impact event. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you all today. Please forgive me, I have a little bit of a cold, but I'm sure we can get through this just fine. My name is Tabrizi, and I am the director of the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy. When our film was released earlier this year, nothing could have prepared us for the huge impact and shockwaves that it sent around the world. The documentary rapidly climbed to the top 10 movies on Netflix in about 50 countries. It broke headlines around the world, went viral online, and sparked an entire movement which has forever changed the way we think of ocean conservation. But at almost every stage in making the film, we were pushing ourselves as hard as we possibly could, putting our cameras in situations we never dreamed of. We took great risks to tell a story that for so long had been silenced, and along the way found ourselves confronting countless wildlife traders, being followed by dozens of police, and finding ourselves in the water as 150 whales were brutally slaughtered before us. And over the years it took to make the film, I learned some extremely valuable lessons that apply not only to protecting the ocean, but to the environment at large. And so when I heard about this glacier's vision to build an effective global community for carbon reduction by taking these massive global problems and condensing them into simple, actionable steps, I got really excited because in essence, that's exactly what we did with Seaspiracy. If we're going to solve this massive ecological crisis, then we need to look at this in terms of small steps that we can actually do. And this is exactly how we do it. Because the problem is not that people don't care about the environment. It's not that people don't believe that there's a real problem, because most people will tell you that the ecological crisis is the most important crisis we have and we need to solve. The real problem is that people feel overwhelmed by the information and unempowered and don't have the know-how to turn their passion into action. What does it really mean on a day-to-day basis to live more ethically or sustainably? Words like climate change or carbon dioxide are just abstractions. It's human beings' attempts clawing at the natural world to try and understand it, but they are just one metric that is being used to measure the human and environmental relationship. But do we really know what that means? And are carbon dioxide levels really what we should be caring about? Is that really what we want to guide all human decision-making going forward? I mean, why not methane? Why not nitrous oxide? Maybe the metric should be the number of trees or the number of fish in our oceans or a country's GDP. What is the torch that humanity is going to use to light up the dark and mysterious road ahead? It may sound funny coming from me opening up this climate impact event about carbon reduction, but I am certain that we should not be using this colorless or odorless gas of CO2 to center all of our discussions about environmental policy. Carbon reduction should be a consequence of the right process, but it is not the process itself. In the same way that a flower is a consequence of planting and watering a seed. If the entire planet shifted towards renewable zero-emission energy tomorrow, we would still be right on track for the ecological destruction we're now witnessing, because we are killing our oceans, the forests, the land, the soil, the insects, the pollinators, the animals, the rivers, all have nothing to do with emissions or renewable energy, because it has everything to do with us and our human consciousness. So I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you all some stories from the front lines of making Seaspiracy, which helped me realize the most effective yet simple actions that we can all take individually or as organizations or companies, and how changing our hearts and minds is really at the core of all of this. After all, our planet is a blue one, and the oceans are the biggest carbon sink on Earth. And so any meaningful conversation about the state of our climate or environment must first start with a serious reevaluation about our interaction with the seas. My interaction with the seas started with childhood. Growing up, the most exciting wild animal that I would ever see at the beach was a seagull. All the dolphins and the whales and the other wildlife have mostly vanished from UK coastlines. Until this day, I've never seen a live dolphin in UK waters. So I envied explorers like Jacques Cousteau or David Attenborough, and I would rely on watching their documentaries of the natural world to vicariously explore the planet we live on. My bedroom walls would glow with the colors of the TV screen, from the kaleidoscope hues of the Great Barrier Reef to the Pacific Ocean, teeming with silvery swaying fish and majestic great whales. To me, the oceans were indestructible and filled with life. However, in my teenage years, I think I was about 17, one of these huge whales practically washed up on my doorstep on a beach just down the road from where I lived. And I had never seen an animal so huge in my entire life. And I felt completely robbed of the opportunity to see this incredible animal alive, a creature I had admired from afar in National Geographic magazines. But in the coming months and years, news came in of other strandings in the UK and then elsewhere around the world, and the autopsies of these whales were all showing large pieces of plastic in their stomach. Naturally, I was sent down a path of ditching plastic straws and anything made of plastic, and before I knew it, I was tumbling down this rabbit hole to try and learn as much as I could about what was happening to our ocean. I wanted to close the gap between what I thought I knew and what was actually happening on the other side of the horizon. I soon realized that the oceans were actually in peril and life was vanishing. With this mission to try and understand what the leading killer of the oceans were and what could be done to save it, together with my co-director Lucy, we first journeyed to the dolphin and whale killing beaches of Taiji in southern Japan. The reason being that since dolphins and whales help fertilize phytoplankton in the ocean, which are these tiny marine plants which absorb about 80%, produce up to 80% of the world's oxygen and store massive amounts of CO2, that in order to save the ocean and climate, then it made sense to first start with protecting whales and dolphins. Now, I'm not sure if we're allowed back in Japan after making Seaspiracy, but while we were there, often filming in torrential rain, hiding from police in hilltop bushes as we overlooked the killing beaches down below us, we began to get a real sense of what was going on. See, activists had been telling the public to boycott marine parks for years, since places like SeaWorld spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get just a single dolphin from a wild place like Taiji. But we realized this was just the tip of the iceberg, because we worked out as we watched every pod of dolphin come in and get slaughtered, we realized that for every one dolphin that was taken from marine parks, an average of 12 others were killed. Now, dead dolphins don't perform tricks, so what could possibly be going on? It turned out that the dolphins were being slaughtered as a form of pest control. The local fishing industry believed that dolphins were eating too many fish, and since their highest goal was the number of fish in the oceans that they could catch and not the protection of dolphins, they felt justified in blaming and ultimately killing the dolphins. Of course, I think we all realize that this is an insane form of scapegoating, because the local fishing industry just so happened to be one of the largest tuna ports on Earth, which was landing some of the most valuable fish in the world, which is then sent to consumers in London, Paris, New York, Vienna, and beyond, which is all part of this $42 billion a year tuna industry, which is now at risk of collapse due to overfishing and these huge industrial fleets that go out there and wipe out virtually everything. The fishing industry caused the vanishing fish populations and then went on to blame and slaughter the dolphins for their own mistakes. This was my first encounter with something called cognitive dissonance, which is the conflict that occurs within us when someone holds two opposing ideas at the same time. But it wouldn't be the last time I encountered this. But what it taught me was the importance of being self-critical in the ways that we view nature simply as commodities, which if we have some agenda for, we can just simply take. For example, when someone says, "Oh, I love fish, I eat it almost every day," the reality is that the person doesn't love fish, they love eating dead fish. It's not the same. We simultaneously view ourselves as a nation of animal lovers, but at the same time, we kill about 35,000 animals for food every second, which is about 3 billion every day. When it comes to sharks, a vital species in the ocean's carbon cycle, we slaughter up to 30,000 every hour. So from Japan, we journeyed to Hong Kong to confront the epicenter of the world's shark fin trade. This is an industry responsible for the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of millions of sharks every year. And as you walk down the streets of Hong Kong, one shop after the next is literally packed to the ceiling with shark fins, which are then served in high-end restaurants for $100 a bowl. Despite the bad reputation of sharks, they are the ecosystem engineers of the ocean. They have thrived on this planet before trees even existed on land. But for the first time ever, many of these species are now going extinct because of us. So what can we do about it? For decades, the only solution the public had been presented with was to boycott shark fin soup, something you can only really buy in Southeast Asia. And it left the rest of us feeling powerless that we couldn't do anything about it. But as we began speaking with experts on the ground, we learned that the majority of sharks being killed at sea were the result of the global fishing industry, either directly being targeted or in the form of bycatch. Essentially, that when we consume wild-caught fish, we may be paying for the killing of far more sharks than if we just went ahead and ate shark fin soup. As we journeyed from one country to the next, the more this pattern surfaced of the fishing industry being the leading culprit, but also the culprit that had been most overlooked. It had already wiped out 90% of the large fish in our oceans, was the leading polluter of plastic in huge swaths of our oceans. 6 out of 7 sea turtle species are now threatened because of the fishing industry. The same industry that's wiping out 300,000 whales, dolphins, and porpoises every year, and 5 million fish every single minute. And every day we are learning more about this industry's impact on climate, with bottom trawling releasing more carbon dioxide every year than all the world's air travel combined. This method of bottom trawling is by far the most destructive form of fishing. The largest trawl nets are so big they can swallow up entire cathedrals or up to 13 jumbo jets. The nets drag heavy weights at the bottom of the ocean, which scar the seafloor that were once abundant with life and leave it barren, like a wasteland, with just a plume of muddy carbon behind it. This is just like bulldozing pristine Amazonian rainforest, except it's far, far worse. Up to 25 million acres of forest are lost every year on land, which is equivalent to losing about 27 soccer fields every minute. However, bottom trawling wipes out 3.9 billion acres every year, which is equivalent to losing 4,316 soccer fields every minute. And these marine plants at the bottom of the sea floor are up to 20 times more effective at trapping carbon than rainforests on land. And if you tally up all the sea floor that is demolished every year, it becomes the equivalent land area of Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the UK, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Turkey, Iran, Thailand, and Australia combined every year. Luckily, Austria survived my analogy. But what it demonstrates is that all of this ecological damage is done by just small decisions multiplied over and over and over again by millions of people who are simply making one choice on the menu at lunch as opposed to another. Now, there was one point in our journey that more than any other that we really cemented the fact that we're all connected to the ocean, and our decisions here in the UK or Austria are playing a role in what is happening to on the other side of our blue planet. And it's not only to marine life, but also to people as well. One night, we found ourselves 200 miles off the coast of West Africa. We were there with the Liberian Coast Guard and were working in tandem with an organization called Sea Shepherd in their fight to hunt down poachers at sea. And on one particular night in the pitch black around 3 a.m., we myopically climbed down this swaying rope ladder on the side of this huge moving ship that we were on. And then we jumped down into one of 2 speedboats that would then jet off across the abyss to a tiny light that we could just about see far on the horizon. And as the boat smashed against the waves with each stride, skimming along the surface at rapid speed, our knuckles turned white from gripping onto the chair in front of us tighter and tighter. Our cameras were getting drenched, our feet were soaked. Lucy and I, my co-director, looked around at each other and wondered what on earth we were doing here. And after about an hour of speeding across the ocean, we were finally on the tail of a ship. It was a huge rusty vessel with eroded paint, trailing behind it the stench of old fish and diesel. But the chase went on for another 20 minutes. The vessel ignored our calls to stop. Perhaps it was buying time to destroy evidence, perhaps trying to outrun us, or most likely comfortably unaware that there would ever be any consequences to their illegal actions this far at sea. Eventually, the fishing trawler was boarded and inspected, and its hull was just completely filled with fish that it had caught illegally. And after the Coast Guard and Sea Shepherd finished gathering evidence, we began making our way back to port with the detained ship. Their work was done, and now Lucy and I could collapse on the boat after being part of probably the coolest thing we'd ever done. But not long later, I noticed two men rowing up to the ship in a small canoe, just as the sun was rising. Now, the West African coastline is now home to about half of all piracy incidents around the world. It has become the new Somalia. So when I caught sight of these two men in the boat, I seriously began to worry. On the east and now west coast of Africa, illegal fishing vessels have stolen so much fish that humble fishermen are now resorting to piracy to make a living, commandeering ships like the one I was on with old AK-47s and holding the crew hostage for ransom. I watched incredibly intensely as one of the men in the canoe put down an oar. And as he lifted his hand, I expected him to perhaps pick up a gun or begin flagging us down, but instead he just raised his hand to his mouth and began begging for food. And at that moment, my fear was replaced with sadness, but also anger. The industrial fishing operations in the waters around us were wiping out everything in their efforts to catch the tuna people buy in cans on supermarket shelves. And in the process, were stealing the food from impoverished local communities. The men I was looking at through my camera's viewfinder were the victims of ignorance. But what made this even worse was that the families of those men could no longer feed themselves. And as a result, they were turning to the jungle to look for food, which has boosted the consumption of bushmeat of endangered animals like pangolins, bats, monkeys, and other mammals, which are hosts to deadly zoonotic diseases like Ebola. If we got ourselves into this situation with small choices that none of us really think about, then we can get ourselves out of this equally tiny and actionable choices. Because the ramifications of poor and ignorant decision-making are unimaginable and vast. But within this chaos lies a huge amount of power to make things right. There's this old quote from Gandhi that said, "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats the most vulnerable members." And what I have found is that when we adopt the process of expanding our circles of compassion to include other creatures, the byproduct or the consequence of that will be reduced carbon levels, will be healthy oceans, will be abundant forests, thriving species, clear rivers, and clean air. And what is amazing is that this rather cliche sounding call to action, which is to love and show respect for life and the natural world, love is the answer in some way, it has the data to back it up. Researchers at the University of Oxford found that when we remove animal products from our diet, we can reduce an individual's carbon footprint from food by up to 73%, and concluded that this was the single biggest way to reduce our environmental impact. This goes far beyond the ocean. Animal agriculture as a whole occupies 83% of all agricultural land. It is the leading cause of deforestation on land, the leading cause of species extinction. It's the leading contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest consumer of fresh water, the leading cause of dead zones in our waterways, and the list goes on and on and on. So my hopes are that before we get into talks of radically transforming society with solar panels on every roof and carbon taxes on everything, let's first focus on the biggest impact we can all make with what is on our dinner plates. Together, we can truly transform the world by adopting this process of expanding our circles of compassion, and the consequences will take care of themselves. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to an interesting Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ali, for sharing your experiences with us. They are inspiring, but still kind of frightening as well. We collected some questions from the audience for you, and I'll just start with the first question, which was, what was the main inspiration to make such a film like Seaspiracy?
I mean, you know, all my life I felt a bit like an outsider. And so I was naturally someone that was quite curious about the world and wasn't afraid to ask awkward or difficult questions because I wasn't trying to please anyone. And so for me, the biggest mystery was the ocean. And I'd always been fascinated with the ocean. And I realized I really didn't know much about the ocean, despite the fact I'd lived by it my whole life and I was passionate about it, I was curious about it. And so that started the engines turning for me to try and investigate deeper and try and get to the bottom of what was going on. And I fully intended when I was younger to make a documentary kind of like David Attenborough's, with beautiful slow motion shots of whales jumping out the ocean with classical music in the background, just showing the beauty. But when it came time for me, when I was in my early, when I was about 22, when I started making the film, I realized that the oceans weren't like that anymore. This rose-tinted vision, this romantic, naive view of the seas wasn't the same. And so I couldn't fool myself, and I needed to explore this other side to the story.
You had such an impact on so many people, including me. But has Seaspiracy had the impact you were hoping for? On which players in which way?
That's a great question, because when I first embarked on making Seaspiracy, it was a film that I never intended would be seen by many people. I thought that maybe a couple of environmental film festivals with like 50 people would watch it. And
well, it was a bit bigger, a little bit bigger.
It was a little bit bigger. I mean, and so I didn't really have any expectation. It kind of just happened. And when Netflix decided to take it on, we were pleased by that. We were excited by that. But again, Netflix has a lot of documentaries. I thought it would get buried. But in the first few days of the film being released, when Kourtney Kardashian is sharing it, and just all these celebrities, and Paul McCartney from the Beatles, and all these different people were sharing it, I realized, oh wow, it's taken a life of its own. And we were getting about 10 emails every minute for weeks from people around the world telling us that it's had a huge impact on their life. They're no longer going to be consuming wildlife from the ocean. They've gone plant-based, and they're starting to clean the oceans. And it wasn't just people from the UK or America or mainland Europe, but it was from people in small villages in Japan that had been fishing their whole lives. And so for me, the consumer impact has been incredible. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to also have a political impact. And we have a petition on change.org to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030, which is almost at 900,000 signatures, which we're going to be bringing to the UK government. And the impact is continuing. It's on our social media pages at Seaspiracy, and it's continuing to live on beyond what I ever imagined.
What about political stakeholders? One of the questions from Matt was, what kind of response from political stakeholders did your documentary trigger in the end?
Well, it was interesting because about a few weeks after the film was released, or about a month later, we had the G7 summit, which was in the UK. It was in June or July. And the oceans started to become more and more on the agenda. It was in the news, and it was also from the political voices. News from Joe Biden that they were going to increase the marine protected areas of the US waters. Boris Johnson from the UK also starting to talk more about the oceans. And we actually got word from someone that we know that, well, I'm not sure if I should say, but basically we heard that Boris Johnson and his wife have watched Seaspiracy. And so we know that politicians also tune into Netflix. And I'm sure it's having a role there as well. Unfortunately, those kinds of changes are a lot slower because it's a slower moving ship, and politicians have a lot more work to do when it comes to that. So I think the impact that we're seeing on the consumer level has been rapid and fast. And I think it's going to be telling over the next few years whether it's had an impact in politics.
So going back from this big picture to me as an individual, one climate ranger raised the question, he or she doesn't eat a lot of fish. But if so, which fish is the most sustainable to eat? Is there a solution to that?
There is. The most sustainable fish that you can eat is vegan fish. Okay, so go into the supermarkets in the frozen vegetarian aisle and you can get some vegan fish options. That will be the most sustainable. Now, for me, it often comes down to this battle of ideas between sustainability and ethics, because for me, it's technically sustainable to kill human beings and eat human meat, or to kill dogs, because we have a lot of dogs, but it's not ethical. We need to start using ethics to guide sustainability, because sustainability just means doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, which is kind of like insanity. So for me, the first thing we need to do is change our hearts and not look to animals to kill them, to eat their bodies, but to look for better, more ethical alternatives and shifting towards plant-based agriculture, which has its problems, but it's planets ahead in terms of ethics. So that's what we need to move in the direction of.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Climate Impact Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.